You are listening to part 6 of our 28-part series, The 7 Medicines, The Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio. Hello, Susan. Welcome to Time Monk Radio.
Hi, Gemini. So let's see. Last week we were talking about story, and we were talking a little bit about family story. Does your family have a story about you, Gemini?
Oh, I'm sure they most certainly do. But actually, what I was thinking last week and pondered the rest of this week is, my grandparents are still living. They're in their late 80s, early 90s, and I love their stories. Even though I've heard them, I don't know how many times, I do identify with them, and it would be odd not to hear those stories.
And you don't like for them to change the stories?
No, because I remember every detail, and if something changes, I'm like, wait a minute, I don't recall that one.
Because this is part of story. Story gives us that real. It's such a secure feeling when we have the story. Thank you for bringing your grandparents here and for giving us all that warm-hearted feeling of the grandparents' stories. That's just so important. And where we usually come face to face with story is when we are sick in some way, whether we are injured or whether we have some illness. Something's not going right, we have a pain somewhere, something odd is going on. And we tend, as human beings, when something is hurting or something seems to be amiss in our bodies, to very quickly make up very scary stories. I'll give you an example. I sprained my wrist in January. I still have some tingling in my hand. Now, what story did I make up? My hand is tingling. That means the nerves are dying. Once the nerves die, there'll be no circulation in my hand, and it will turn into gangrene, and it will have to be amputated. Well, just like that, 5 seconds, and I go from tingling to amputation.
Yes.
And I say this because it's not just me, is it?
No, it's not.
It's all of us, right? We can take the tiniest pain and turn it into a death sentence so fast.
Yes.
And then we have terrorized ourselves, and we've put ourselves into that state of fear where the mind does not work very well anymore. And then we kind of partly realize that we're not thinking well, and we seek help. We talked about the first medicine, Serenity Medicine, which is a very private medicine. You do Serenity Medicine in yourself. You do Serenity Medicine by yourself. You don't talk to other people in Serenity Medicine. You're quiet. You're still. You're meditating. You're going with what's happening. You're not arguing. You're not putting yourself in any of those situations. You just are. And when we get to the second medicine, we open up naturally to desiring others' input. We have enough sense of ourselves through Serenity Medicine to say, my mind is really terrorizing me about what's going on here. I need someone else to help me out, to be a voice of reason, or to say, oh, no, it's much worse than what you think. We would go either way. That's fine. But we want someone else. When we get to the second medicine, we want that other person to tell us what is going on. So we go, usually, for a diagnosis. Now, a diagnosis is obviously and clearly a story. I have a pain here. The diagnostician says, oh, that pain tells me you have, and names a disease. You have multiple sclerosis. You have arthritis. You have chronic fatigue. And we then receive that diagnosis and begin to treat it. Now, this brings us to a place in which we cease to exist. What do I mean by that? You go to the person who's going to make a diagnosis as a person who has a body which is somehow not the way you want it to be. It hurts somewhere, it's sneezing, it's coughing, blood is coming out from odd places, something is going on with this body. But you're a person in a body. When you have a diagnosis, you no longer have a body. You now have a word. And you begin to treat the word rather than to actually treat your body. Worse yet, if you've gone to an MD or an ND or a chiropractor or a massage therapist or an acupuncturist or anyone who has been trained in a healing profession, they have been trained to relate certain symptoms to certain diseases, which then trigger in them certain ways of acting to deal with that disease. Again, the person disappears. Now, the person is the only thing that's really important in the wise woman tradition. In the scientific tradition, we measure. You don't measure up, you get fixed. So how perfect. That's what we want to do in the scientific. We don't want to deal with people. Excuse me. People are messy. People are erratic. People are far too unique. Oh, my goodness. We don't want that. We want protocols. We want drugs. We want standardized doses. We want to know what to do. When we look at herbs from the scientific tradition, we want to find the active ingredient in the plant. We want to take all the active ingredients out, put back that one active ingredient at a certain standardized dose, and then call that herbal medicine, because that's what we want to do in the scientific tradition, because we're going to use that herbal medicine to treat a disease. Our language even makes this the norm. You read books about alternative medicine, and they are filled with a language that leads you to believe that this herb treats headaches. This herb does this. People will often ask me, do you have an herb that's good for headaches? And I say, well, actually, better than an herb for headaches would be a small child with a drum. And they look at me like I have lost my mind and say, you want something for headaches, right? Your body believes every word you say. You seem to believe you're saying something else, but you're saying what you are saying. I want something for a headache. Your body hears that and says, wants something for headache. Must give this being headache. They want a headache. They just ask for a headache. You don't think you asked for a headache, but your body does, because you haven't really listened to what you're saying. In fact, I have an editor for my books that I call the Those With editor. And the Those With editor goes through what I have written to make sure that I don't say oat straw is good for this, that I say oat straw is good for those with this. So the Those With editor makes sure that the person precedes the problem. There was a amazing healer, I think he might still be alive, named Savo, I believe his last name is Brooks, Savo Brooks. And I remember he's an herbalist going to one of his workshops, and he talked about how he deals with clients, and he sets aside at least 2 hours to listen to the client. And this goes back, we were talking last week about the three-legged stool of nourishment, which is what we eat, the rituals, and compassionate listening. So he sets aside a great deal of time for his intake interview. He does not give the people who are coming to him a list that you check off, I have this, I don't have this. No, he sits with them and says, tell me what's wrong with your body. Tell me what's wrong with your work. Tell me what's wrong with your children. Tell me what's wrong with your parents. Tell me what's wrong with your house. Tell me what's wrong with your life. Tell me, and he has this whole series of tell me what's wrong with, and he takes copious notes. He writes it all down, writes it all down, and then finally he gets to, is there anything you need to tell me that there's something wrong with that I haven't asked? They say he writes it down until we get to the place where the person says, no, I have told you everything that's wrong in my life. And Seva then told us that he would then look at the notes, and sometimes they would be pages and pages of notes, pick them up, and in view of that person, throw them in the trash. And say, we have now gotten rid of everything that's wrong with your life, and we are now going to focus on what's right with your life and nourish that. What a different story, isn't it? I often blame the books that trained me as a child to look for what's wrong in this picture. Right? This is one of the tasks we give children. What's wrong in this picture? And so it taught me, as an adult in this culture, to look for what's wrong. And it didn't teach me to look for what's right, what's perfect, what's okay, what's working. Right? I'm out in the world. I'm out there professionally doing a lot of stuff. And there are people who have problems with me. There are people who do not like me at all. And these people can be, often more vociferous than the people who like me. And one of them had written something particularly nasty, and my daughter was upset about it, and she said, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I said, you know what? There's always going to be people who don't like me. There's always going to be people who have problems with what I do, what I say, how I am, da-da-da. And I said, and I'm not worried about getting rid of any of those things. What I prefer to listen to is the people who say, I like this, and then I do my best to give them more. Because I'm going to be happier doing that, and I'm going to make the people who are already happy happier. And you know what I found out in living 70 years on this planet? The people who are unhappy are usually going to stay unhappy, no matter what you change. That's not to say I don't have compassion for their unhappiness, or I don't have, feeling for why they're upset with me. Sometimes I understand completely, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to let what isn't liked be the ruler of my life. So we go for a diagnosis. We go for a story. We want to know what's wrong. If we go to an MD for a diagnosis, the great likelihood is that that MD is not willing to make a diagnosis without some high-tech imaging. Now, ever since we've had high-tech imaging, CAT scans, and MRIs, I have been saying to people, you must understand that these high-tech diagnoses are not in the second river, they are in the seventh river. And we remember that the first river can't harm, the second river has very little harm, and that we move up in possibility and extent of harm as we move through the rivers, so that the seventh river is a guarantee of harm, possibility of death, possibility of a lifetime of problems. So when we go seeking a story in the second river, one of the things that happens to many of us is that a hatch door opens and, like Alice, we are sucked into the strange world of high-tech diagnosis, and suddenly we find ourselves having a CAT scan, having an MRI, and being told a whole lot of things that we probably don't need to know or pay attention to. There was an article that I've just been reading by a very interesting man from India who comments frequently on medical matters. And I was especially interested in this article because it's an article about exactly what we're talking about, overdiagnosis. And he claims that we are over-diagnosing to the extent of 90% of the diagnoses are totally overboard, which leads to unnecessary surgery and a lot of unnecessary fear and stress for the people. One of the simplest ways to talk about this is to talk about mammograms. Basically, what are we being told? We're being told a story. You could develop breast cancer. Now, what are we told about this story? We're told 1 in 3 women will develop breast cancer over her lifetime. Now, that's true, but your risk of breast cancer varies according to your health and your age. If you are over 90, 1 in 3 women will be diagnosed with breast cancer. But if you're 20, it's only 1 in 20,000. So yes, we can truthfully say over your lifetime, 1 in 3 women will be diagnosed with breast cancer. But living past the age of 90 is not going to be for every single woman. And so right away, we're told the story that although it is true, is not true in the way we interpret it. In other words, most women interpret this story to mean that their risk right now today of being diagnosed with breast cancer is 1 in 3, and it is not at all. So now we've frightened the women. What is the point of this story? Is the point of this story to get women to eat better? Is the point of this story to get women to take better care of themselves? No, the point of this story is to get women to go for a high-tech diagnostic test called a mammogram, which uses radiation. And radiation causes cellular changes that lead to cancer. When the idea of doing X-ray examinations of the breast was first floated, the basic response from X-ray technicians was, this is absolutely absurd. We can't use radiation on the breast because breast tissue is second only to the ovaries in its sensitivity to radiation and its tendency to have cancer follow exposure to radiation. So exposure to radiation that wouldn't necessarily cause cancer in your bone or cancer in your skin or cancer in your lungs or your heart or your liver or your brain could cause cancer in your breast. And the Eastman Kodak, who makes the mammography film, said, we have a whole advertising program guaranteed to scare women into doing this. So the story of mammograms starts with the story of fear, causing women to be afraid. The story is not for health, it's for fear. So women then fearfully go and get a mammogram. Of every 10 women who are told there's a problem with their mammogram, depending on the technology that's used and the imaging center that's used, anywhere between 7 to 9 of those women, 70 to 90% of those women, will have a biopsy in which the finding will be nothing is wrong. So we're talking about at least 7 out of 10 women have unnecessary surgery. And once you've had surgery, you are now considered high risk for breast cancer. And so you are asked to have more mammograms. And those mammograms, in fact, will increase your risk for breast cancer. And so we can see that rather than a story that promotes health, we have fallen for a story of fear that actually promotes overtreatment and damage to ourselves. Again, it is that trap door which is opened up into the seventh medicine. Anytime we are using high-tech medicine, we are in the seventh river. There's a women's health clinic that I support with the financial contributions, and they sent out a special request for donations that they wanted to get a particular diagnostic machine in their office. And I wrote back to them and I said, I am not going to give you any money for this, because the fact of the matter is that the cost of the machine, for the cost of that machine, you could hire a woman to give you this same information, and you could hire her for 10 years of paid work for what this one machine is going to cost you. And they wrote back to me and said, you are absolutely right, but no one would believe the woman. So this is another part of diagnosis too, isn't it? Would we believe the medical intuitive, or would we believe the machine? Insofar as we would only believe the machine's story, we ourselves have created that trapdoor. Insofar as we need to have a name for what's going on with us that is distressing us, then we ourselves have created the trapdoor in the second river that takes us to the seventh river and takes us to possible death and possible lifelong difficulties because we wanted a story. Now, one of the things that we know about a diagnosis that's very commonly said is you need a second opinion. When you go and you get a diagnosis, that's just one person's opinion, and so you need to have a second opinion. And I am all for a second opinion, especially when it comes to diagnosis. But I suggest that that second opinion come from someone who really has a different story to tell you. So suppose you have gone to a acupuncturist and you have this lump that is in your breast, and the acupuncturist tells you this is liver fire, and we're going to be needling these points, and you're going to be drinking these herbs to cool off this liver fire. Now, that's certainly a diagnosis. And yet, if you were to go to an MD, the MD might say, we need a biopsy, we need to look at this tissue, this is this kind of cancer, the prognosis with this kind of cancer is this, I would offer you this, 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 and this. And now you have really heard two very different stories. And you're in a position then to actually make a choice between those different stories. Do I want to go with liver fire? Do I want to go with this is what I am being offered? There are no wrong decisions. We always make the very best decision we can at any time, given the knowledge that we have at that time about what's going on. And so we cannot make a wrong decision. We can needlessly and mercilessly harass ourselves about the decisions we have made, but it's not going to change those decisions. So I ask people to take time in serenity medicine before they decide on a story to choose. Let me give you a kind of silly example of this. I was out at the Talking Stick Circle with my apprentices one morning in a car that I didn't recognize, drove up the driveway, stopped, and this woman leaped out and came running over to us and took off her shirt. And her back was a horrible mess of huge, red, swollen, I didn't even know what to make of it. And she said, hives. Look, my back is covered in hives. Well, it could very well have been hives. It's true. Note that she's using a word, a diagnosis word. My back is covered in hives. What do I do for the hives? So it is interesting right off to me that she's already not in her body. She's already not saying, look at what's going on in my back. Can you help me? She's already made herself a diagnosis, named what is going on, and she wants me to deal with, fix, cleanse, nourish, whatever I want to do, this word, this problem that now has little or nothing to do with her. And I know that it's very easy for me to accept that if I am not very careful. Because it's easy for all of us to say, oh, you have a headache. Well, this herb gets rid of headaches, instead of actually being present with that person and finding out, what does your head feel like? What's really going on? How are you feeling? What are you thinking? What's going on in your life? A headache is certainly more than just a headache. So I looked at her back. It was very messed up. It was very red. It was very swollen. It looked terrible. And I heard her say hives. And I was just about to jump on her little float and go off in the hives parade when I was able to stop myself and say, how long has this been going on? Her answer was very telling, 3 days. Now, hives, horrible as they can be, don't last for 3 days. Hives are short-lived phenomena. You can have a hive which is an inflammatory, somewhat allergic reaction to something, but those hives flare up, they're really red, they really itch, and then on their own, usually, they go away. So either this was some really horrible thing, or it wasn't hives at all. And so I said a question that so many of my mentors and so many of my teachers have taught me to say, and I hope that I can leave this question with you as well. What happened in your life just before this happened? What immediately preceded this? This is not necessarily going to be a cause and effect relationship, but asking what happened just before will often open up new and interesting things that we might want to think about. And she looked at me and she said, what do you mean? I said, like in the past week. Anything new happening in your life this past week? She said, no, nothing besides my new kitten. I said, oh, where does your new kitten sleep? In bed with me, cuddled up against my back. I said, guess what? Your new kitten has fleas. She said, what? I said, yeah, your back is covered in flea bites. Your new kitten has fleas. She said, oh. She went home. She called me. She said, you're right. My new kitten is loaded with fleas. I had no idea. Now, we could have treated hives, and in fact, the treatment for the hives would not have been that different from the treatment for the flea bites. But because I stopped myself from jumping on that word and floating with it to its end, and because I remembered what my teachers had taught me to ask what had come before, a new door opened up to me. And I was able to see a greater part of what was going on with this woman and offer something besides a cure. There's nothing wrong with curing, but it isn't healing. Curing means we've gotten rid of today's pain. We've gotten rid of today's problem. But it's going to come back again and again and again because we haven't really gotten to the point of healing. Healing is to make whole. Healing is to make holy. And most of us approach our pain and our problems as the greatest enemy that we have, rather than embracing them and bringing them into us and creating a story of wholeness. We create a story of fighting, warfare, and disintegration. There's so much that I could say about story medicine, and there is so much that is being said about story medicine. It seems to me that almost every week now, I see a new book that is telling me more about stories and story medicine and how we are finding that they are critical to real healing, not just curing, not just getting rid of what bothers us, but really becoming whole, which is a different story altogether. And that's what we're going to be talking about next week. We're going to be talking about how stories can nourish us. And we're going to be talking about how stories bring us into relationship, bring us into connection, and bring us into community. And that's where we started, isn't it, Gemini? We started with you reminding us about the stories of your grandparents and how important it is to you to hear those stories of your grandparents. And last week I talked about Farmer John and how important it is to him to tell the stories of his family, because stories weave us together. So I thank you all for once again being with me, being with Susan Weed here at Time Monk Radio, and being with Gemini, our wonderful host here, as we reweave the healing cloak of the ancients and explore the 7 rivers of healing. Good night, Gemini.
Good night, Susan. This concludes part 6 of our discussions on the 7 medicines, the Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio.